My name is Min Kyung Lee. I'm the Banister Fletcher Fellow for this year, hosted by the University of London Institute of Paris. And I want to extend a thank you to Eric, who is doing the technical support for all of this programming, but also the Director of Research, Anna Louise Milne, who's been just an amazing colleague and interlocutor in this strange COVID situation. So she'll be managing the chat area and the Q&A, and I'll be moderating our distinguished and a wonderful panel of scholars. So I just want to direct your attention to a few resources. One is that the entire program of this year, which is the quantification of urban space, all of the recordings are up on the ULIP website. So if you've missed anything or you want to go back, those resources are there. Also, just like we did with the very first panel on mapping and measures, we have a reading list or selected bibliography that's associated with this session. And you'll also be able to download that if you're interested in continuing your studies on these topics. The other thing that I'd like to mention for all of you is that there is a workshop tomorrow. And it's a workshop because it's much more informal. We have Andre Dufour, who is the head of location services for Amazon, who is not an academic, but he's in charge of the company, all of the mapping applications and programs and platforms that the company has been developing, is developing, and is using. And he'll be talking about different tools and instruments that they're thinking about. I also asked Professor Engin Eisen, who's a professor of political science at ULIP, to be a discussant and to guide our kind of our thinking around these topics of mapping in our contemporary world. Okay, with that, I'd just like to quickly introduce all of our panelists for this conversation, and then we're going to just move in directly to the conversation. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to type them into the Q&A, and we'll definitely be on top of that and feed them to the panelists. Now, I'm just going to go in alphabetical order pretty quickly. We have Soni Devabhaktuni. Soni is a architect and a writer and a theorist. He works at the University of Hong Kong, and his work really spans from, he's working on the relations between dance and architecture, theories of collaboration, and other kind of really micro scale projects that are really beautiful. The reason why I asked him to join the discussion today is that he has this really sensitive attention to the everyday materials that compose our lived environment. And I think he has some important observations on that, especially with regard to where he's living now. I've also asked Wendy Espeland, who is a professor of sociology at Northwestern. She is the expert on commensuration and their social effects and meanings, how numbers come to define us. So she's joining us here today as somebody who's going to help us think about quantification. We also have Paul Jascott. He's a professor of art history at Duke University. Paul's work addresses specifically German art and architecture that engages in kind of social questions of political economy. He's also been writing a lot and thinking a lot about methods in art historical research, especially around issues of mapping and data. So all of those combined is the reason why I asked him to join us today. There's Ayala Levine. She is a professor in the architecture. Is it a department or a school? Is it?
Department.
It's the department, architecture department at UCLA. She writes on the history of architecture and planning in the global South, especially looking at Israeli settlements and investments, I shouldn't say settlements, but investments in Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. We have Christopher Marcinkowski, who is an architect and teaches in the landscape architecture department at the University of Pennsylvania. He's written a book about the phenomenon of speculative urbanism. And that was actually one of the reasons why I really had to have Christopher come and talk to us. And that book studied kind of the real estate development boom in Spain and in other places and its consequences. I should also mention that he has another project called the Atlas of African Urbanism that he's been working on. So there's a website associated with that. We also have Evelyn Patterson. She's a demographer, a very multifaceted demographer who has appointments in sociology, law, and the medical school at Vanderbilt University. And Evelyn's work investigates the way in which judicial systems create and perpetuate inequalities and also impacts marginalized populations. And I felt like if we cannot talk about cities without talking about the people who inhabit them and live in them. And so we need to have a demographer. And Evelyn's particular interest in methodology, also in terms of biases, methodological and ontological, I thought would be an important perspective to have. Abdul Malik Simon is an urbanist, a theorist, a writer. I would even say a poet. Some of your texts really and talks are really kind of inspiring in that way. And he's long been committed and invested in understanding and exploring the spatial and social composition of urban agglomerations in the global South. I know that he's working right now specifically on Jakarta. And I would encourage all of you to see the recording of his lecture from last week in the Crisis and Theory, or Theory and Crisis seminar, which is also on the ULIP website. Lastly, I've come to Olga Touloumi. She's an architectural historian, originally from Greece, and now teaching at Bard College. Her work has included studies on feminist pedagogies, acoustics and mass media, collaborations between designers and technologists in computation, computational practices. But most recently, she has a forthcoming book on post-war architecture and their role in international relations, especially related to international institutions. So she's going to bring that perspective to us. Okay, so I've organized the talk in 3 different themes. And those themes are urban measures and mismeasures. The second one is risk and accountability. And the third is scale and speculation. Now, before we go into a conversation about that, I wanted to take a moment just to frame what I meant by speculation in a kind of general way for you and for the audience. So I think when we hear the word speculation, just immediately what comes to mind, especially after, for Americans, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, it's associated with real estate, financial investments, or development. And this kind of view of development and the practices of speculation depend on quantitative valuations, right? Normally through prices. And while we'll talk about today this kind of speculative urbanism, I want to make sure that we account for those quantification practices that make that kind of financialization possible. So what does it mean to quantify space, objects, lives? And this reminds me of a classic historical text. I'm also an architectural historian. This classic historical text by Bill Cronin, Nature's Metropolis. where he traces the 19th century transformation of trees into timber, cows into meat, land into grain, that would eventually feed the city of Chicago and then become the basis for a futures commodity market that not only traded goods, but also traded on the possibility, the temporal possibility of their production. And that he was telling the story of, the making of this city that depended on the aggregation of all these materials from the hinterland, beyond the boundaries of the city, but it transforming and translated into these numbers, right? Credit, essentially. So I bring this example up to show that the tyranny of quantitative metrics, of financialization, and also now under COVID, the massive kind of data that has been gathered of our world, it has a history, right? We're not just talking about the contemporary world, but it has a history. And what that means for me is that it can also have a different trajectory into the future. So in the spirit of the topic of speculation and mismeasures on the table today, I'd like for us, so including the audience members, to take this opportunity to practice a kind of speculation that recovers another meaning of the word that's associated with considering alternatives, other modes of being, other modes of living, other modes of relating to each other, which is also why we wanted to have a group of people to think through these things. Okay, so I want to move directly into that first topic of urban measures and mismeasures. So what have been, and I pose this to our panelists, what have been and are the quantitative values used in defining and building cities, right? So this is a really basic question. I know, I teach a very kind of basic introduction course called Form of the City. And when we look at kind of archaeological studies of ancient cities, we look at area and population, right? Those seem like the most basic ways in which we've defined cities. But obviously there are others, and those categories also don't necessarily tell us much about a city, in fact. So I leave this question open to you, and maybe I'll direct it first to Wendy, our mensuration expert. I mean, what are some of the ways in which you would think about this question of how we quantify, what sort of quantities define cities? Oh, you're muted, Wendy.
You'd think by now I would know how to do that. I'd like to start by saying that I'm not an expert on cities, so I'm eager to learn from those of you who are. But, quantification is a very old practice for making sense of the world. And one of the things that's so valuable about it is how much it simplifies information. So one of the values of numbers is that they're portable and they seem to circulate easily. And we also project onto numbers attributes like objectivity and rigor and rationality. So in terms of cities, the number that I probably am most familiar with, and I'll leave other measures to the other panelists, has to do with rankings. And that's a relatively recent measure of cities, but it's certainly one that's growing. I saw a recent article in sort of Scientific American that said since 2007, there's now more than 500 metrics related to comparing cities, and that those often take the form of rankings. And so what rankings do is construct cities as comparable, and then and that induces a lot of competition. When it's comparable and hierarchical, then it's very easy to see cities located in a kind of a rhetorical space where it makes them amenable to competition in various forms. So I'll stop there with rankings.
Did I see a hand up?
Yeah, I was gonna maybe just follow on that because so I want to thank you first of all for the invitation to be part of this. It's super amazing to be joined or be joining this group of scholars. I always get nervous when I'm with a group of particularly historians because I'm speaking from the point of view of a designer, and we're a little bit promiscuous with the way that we talk about things and the way that we refer to things and sort of quantify things, for lack of a better word. But I do want to pick up on this idea of rankings because I think for me, there's something really fascinating from the designer perspective around rankings and city making and planning, in the sense that it pushes a drive towards replication and emulation as opposed to differentiation. And I think in many cases, when one looks at cities historically, again, this is maybe a promiscuous kind of assessment, but there was an attempt to differentiate. There was an attempt to kind of claim status around one particular thing that is done well or one particular activity that is present. Within particularly the last 30 years, I would say there's a shift in planning and design towards trying to compete on the same terms, which is this appearance of urbanity, as opposed to the economies that are driving that urbanity. And so I just, this idea of ranking for me is really fascinating from a planning point of view, where so many of our institutions within the architecture and urban design disciplines talk about best practices, talk about comparability, in essence, flatten the urban form through this sort of method of emulation. And I really liked what Wendy was saying about quantification is about simplifying. And the idea of simplifying the city to me is sort of problematic just from the outset as a kind of endeavor.
Evelyn, what are your thoughts about how cities are defined through this category of population? So we could think generally about urban population, but then there's so many subcategories within that. Can you talk a little bit about the problems of those of that categorization, how it's done, what the meaning of that is, and the methods of calculating that?
Sure. So I'm coming from a demography background, but also a lot of my work is dealing with correctional populations. And so through the lens of just thinking about demography and how we count people, I'm thinking about the census. And so every 10 years we conduct a census. I'm guessing that 2020 census really sucks, but that's just my speculation. In most nations,
The USA.
In the US, yeah.
In the USA, but also in most nations, the COVID pandemic has pretty much upended census counting. Nevertheless, that is what in the US we rely on in terms of thinking about allocation of resources in general, but also in thinking about political representation. So in the US, inmates are typically counted from the places where they're actually inhabiting. So this is of particular importance when we're thinking about prison populations where there's a longer stay. So if you're in prison, then you're counted in the space in which you're in, which is typically going to be a rural area versus the space which you come from. And this is the case for all states except for maybe California in 2020. They changed things. I'm not sure how COVID may have interrupted that. But regardless, that means that the people who are incarcerated, which are largely coming from marginalized populations that are living in urban areas, are actually not being counted in the spaces where they come from, and which is the spaces they will return to. And instead, they actually enhance the population in these rural spaces, despite the fact that they cannot vote in these spaces. So you have this sort of uplifting of representation then that's going to shift to the rural areas. And then this sort of taking away from urban spaces that has been going on for decades and decades, sort of a very ritualistic divestment going on that just continues to lead to concentrated poverty. So it's not just the concentrated poverty, but it's also the lack of representation to actually even voice that concentrated poverty. And this is all perfectly legal here. It's written into the census, it's written into, I mean, well, how we count people. And even if you think about something like indigenous populations, in I believe section 2 of the census, we state that we're not going to count people that we don't tax. So in terms of what does that mean for the indigenous populations? Well, it means that we continue to divest, which has been a historical basically screw up, or well, I think a purposeful way of actually eliminating a population.
Paul, yeah.
Yeah, I love what Evelyn says about the kind of mismeasurement of people, because I think that it makes me think of the mismeasurement of buildings. And in particular, something I mentioned to you, Min, was the temporal dimension of measuring, right? And this is working with like Danny Abramson's book on obsolescence, but this idea that, oh, well, we can count all these buildings in the city, but which ones are out of date? Oh, no, they're no good anymore, right? That is to say, which ones are designated as slums? And you can see this particularly in the history of Chicago, obviously, not only in the terms of redlining, but also in terms of really major kind of political conflicts, like old Mayor Daley, when he tried to clear part of the near West Side, which was part of urban planning, perfectly legal, right? But in order to do urban planning, you have to designate you have to give a certain area and buildings a temporal designation of, you know, no longer worth it. And that was an interesting case in the 60s, where it was really the first public coalition that rose up against him, led by Florence Scala, famously a kind of housewife on the near West Side, a multi-ethnic community that he was going to clear and build for the university, which was wonderful, right? Public good. But at the same time, it was hand in glove with real estate interests. But I guess my connection with what Evelyn was saying is that it's this mismeasurement, right? It's like, well, who gets to designate what is old, what is antiquated, what is no longer useful, and of course that's not about who is in the community. It's about a kind of a power relationship that the community is subject to. And so time is something that we often overlook as a measurement of cities. But it's a really powerful weapon that people use to disempower.
I think there have been Wendy, yes, please.
I just wanted to follow up on what Evelyn was saying too, and Paul was getting at, in that I think one of the most important things to think about when you're thinking about quantification is how it confers visibility and invisibility, what it makes the focus of attention and what it obscures so that we don't see. So as Evelyn suggested, we obscure certain groups, certain populations, we obscure certain buildings, certain communities. But I think the relations of visibility that are attending particular forms of quantification is a really important thing for scholars and scholars of cities to think about. So now I'll be quiet.
Tony, please.
Min, can I share my screen just very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead, share it, share away.
Let's see. So actually, when you, I think you can see this now, when you asked me to join, I thought actually you were interested in this project I've been working on, our research, and it's on a new city in India that was begun in 2016 and then interrupted in 2019. So work on it really stopped. And I think in terms of mismeasurement and visibility and kind of the redrawing of land through this kind of speculative projects, this one took more than 30,000 parcels of agricultural land, which had been defined over decades, and transformed them into very quantifiable parcels that could be bought and sold very quickly. And that process took place in a matter really of months, that transformation of the land. So this notion of time also, I think, really plays in to the way that this mapping and re-territorialization took place in Amaravati.
Sony, can
Let
you
me-
tell us a little bit more about this image? What are the color codings and
Sure. So the image on the left, you see how the parcels had been defined before 2016, when a process of land pooling took place, where they essentially promised landowners that they would get a new piece of land in this planned city if they gave their old farmland. So on the right, you see the master plan, which was created by a Singaporean consultancy, also the government kind of using languages of kind of language that's more common in the world of consultants, like benchmarking and best practices. So this is the master plan they came up with, which has very defined orthogonal parcels that could be quickly bought and sold, and were all GIS mapped and coordinated. Whereas the earlier map, all of these land registries were kept in the 26 villages that were throughout that site. That's 217 square kilometers. So all of those pieces of land which had been divided over generations, those were, you could say, the information about them was kept in the villages and in registries that were bound in books. So that transformation, I think, was really an important part of the kind of the turning speculative of the land through this whole process of making the city.
Sony, I think you bring up a really good point in your image. It makes me think that we need to also ask ourselves who is doing this counting. I mean, as Evelyn really clearly brought up, the census has really incredible implications politically, socially, economically, and yes, it's the census workers, as we've seen recently with the last Trump administration, that this can be an incredibly politicized effort, not the objective, rational counting that Wendy was mentioning before. So who is doing this counting? Who you mentioned a consulting company in Singapore, right? And are architects complicit in this? Right? Are planners complicit in this? And what are the metrics that they're using?
In this case, I think it's the planning administration that was created by the government to develop the project. This was supposed to be a capital city for a new state that was created. So the planning administration, backed by politicians, backed by speculative capital from Andhra Pradesh and from all over the world of diasporic Andhra Pradesh, former Andhra Pradesh residents. So there was a huge kind of pressure in a way to turn this city into a speculative, to kind of capitalize on the speculative potential of the city. And it was, you could say, enacted by the political administration and by the consultants that they hired, the planners that they hired to kind of draw this new map. But certainly the planners and the planning agency was complicit.
Yeah, Ayala, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't find the function to raise hand. Still struggling with Zoom. So I wanted to jump in with the notion of time, and especially after Sony's description of the creation of a new town in India, and perhaps talk about speculation not in real estate terms. So speculation just as a way to move forward with planning and implementation, while there is no substrate to conduct census or surveys in a prolonged way. And you can see that you can detect this change in the 60s, where planners, especially in the global south, but also in the global north, kind of gave up on planning in the methods that they were accustomed to. The creation of those comprehensive plans in those major tomes of like 9-volume books that would get outdated by the time that they are produced. And especially in fast-moving societies where under pressures of modernization in the global south, these changes have been very extreme. And adding to it is the problem of mismatch. So all this information that a Western planner attempts to excavate in a situation where the information doesn't lend itself to them in this way. So, for example, ownership of land, something that is very hard to map sometimes and figure out the tenure, and ownership of land that cannot be sold or cannot be subject to eminent domain. So we have a situation where the relationship to land is very different in societies where you would still have indirect rule via colonial administration. Or in the case of India, the status of this agricultural land that Sonny was talking about was for I don't know if it still is, but subject to elite, land-owning elite that the colonial rule didn't want to mess with and needed their support. And the same is with chiefs in some places in Africa. So, and then you have the relationship between those rural areas and the cities. And in Africa, chiefs don't want to have their youth migrating to the cities. So they are, they would relinquish labor or public works labor or power to stakeholders in order to implement plans, but only to reinforce their own chiefdoms and preempt rural or urban migration that would be a permanent one. So there are many issues involved that just don't match our conversation when we speak about speculation and real estate development. Development meant something completely different in that period, but also the planners faced a crisis, both a crisis of information or information gathering, and even just registering what they see via their own usual methods, as well as a crisis in general that planners face also in the first world vis-a-vis urban renewal and the power of real estate developers versus the planning institutions. And I can show some images. I have prepared them, but I should do that
Please,
later.
yes, please, Ayala, show us if you want to.
Okay, so maybe so I wanted to get into it via the question of time. Otto Königsberger, this UN planner who worked in Singapore after he worked in Nigeria, came up with this concept of action planning exactly because of his inability to plan in advance and also responding to the Singapore government's plea for fast implementation that would allow them to industrialize and create also the housing market that they're so famous for in just a few years. So the plea of the Singapore government to the UN planners, and they actually wanted, what they wanted was urban renewal a la the US, not realizing that Charles Abrams was a staunch opponent of that. They wanted to redo the plan that the British planners prepared just a few years earlier, and that was already outdated by the time of independence in the early 60s. So Otto Königsberger created this action planning method that I assume has something to do also with the action research methods developed by Kurt Lewin, the group psychologist, which means that decision making and within the group is a democratic process where you have there is no relationship of authority. The authority is from within the group. So and planning, research, and implementation are all folded into the same process. So Otto Königsberger conceptualized that in Singapore, and he talked about the need to work with developers, with speculators, with local speculators in order to promote planning, because otherwise planning won't happen. But he didn't find the right imagery to do that, to express that work. So I found in the work of Israeli architects in Sierra Leone the kind of visual expression of what that meant. And you can see here, this is a national urbanization plan for Sierra Leone that is based on the on lots of let me show you. Is based on many templates like that conflate all information that they could find without doing the actual research themselves, and then just superimposing them in a kind of beautifully proto-computerized visualization techniques that only blurred information in order to arrive at crystallized solutions for the location of cities that would preempt youth from the villages all around here to move to Freetown, the capital, in the peninsula here. So what I argue is that they created the figure of the region, something that organically was conjured out of all this information processing in order to arrive at the highly political decisions of which cities to reinforce out of the existing cities, towns, I should say, in the entire country, with the emphasis of drawing the forces, both economic and population forces, out of Freetown, or balancing those with the economic regions that would come out here in the rest of the country. And I compare this to the administrative boundaries that the British had created. So if there is something extremely fixated and arbitrary in the administrative boundaries, then the regions allow for a kind of economic diversity and dynamism that would eventually also allow for different ethnicities, different chiefdoms to find via economic reasoning mutual grounds. So there is, these are indeterminate. And this indeterminacy that is also expressed very much in the action planning concept is one where the planner and the decision maker and the local elites are all continuously participating in the project of planning. So this is just one example.
I think this is so interesting what you're showing us, Ayala, and it also overlaps very well with the master plan that Sony has just shown us, because they both demonstrate that there's a rhetoric to this quantification, even though there might not be. I mean, what you've just explained is that these were made in the absence of any actual capacity to quantify the resources and the people. And so you develop this visual and graphic rhetoric to seem like it's clear, objective, rational, when in fact, you know, those blobs, what exactly are the boundaries of those blobs? It seems so nice on paper. The lines are so crisp, but the actuality of that, if it's lived, that's the mismatch, right? I mean, and I think it goes back also to what Evelyn is saying, that there are these numbers, but they in the end what are they revealing to us, other than the rhetoric that just frames it? Sony, you have your hand up. I don't know if you want to respond.
No, I don't. Sorry, that was a mistake.
I think Ayala's comments really lead us well into the second prompt that was very much about risk and accountability, that I want to make sure that we talk about, because there are people who bear the risks more than, I mean, there's an uneven distribution of risk, even though these numbers purport to equalize things, as Wendy has reminded, you know, as Wendy mentioned, the promise of these numbers is that it makes things comparable, equal, when in fact, the ways in which those numbers are used, as Evelyn was also mentioned in her comments about the census, they're not distributed evenly, and actually they're often borne, the risks and the consequences, the negative consequences of it are most often borne on people who have the least power, right? And Abdul Malik, I don't know if you wanted to have some comments about this, especially after hearing your talk on Jakarta last week.
Well, I mean, it comes back to the original comment, I think, that Wendy made about the function of quantification as a kind of mode of simplification. And in a way, the city, or at least the imagination of the city as a particular kind of form, is a particular simplification of urbanization processes themselves. It's an abstraction from processes which are continually demonstrate their immunity from computation in many ways. But yet the city is a kind of form of coherence, of enumeration, of specifying differences and relationships between differences, and a coordination of differences. The enumeration of rights and of whose body can be where and what zone and what function. I mean, this is all the fiction of the coherence of the city is somehow emblematic of urbanization processes, where in some ways, in order for that fiction to work, you need forms of agency, forms of work that are not so easily counted, that are not so easily measurable in terms of their proportionality, of whether it is something from a household or individual, you know, who is it, what is it, who's doing it. And this is where, in some sense, the bearing of certain kind of responsibility or burden comes in, because of course, it's well known that in many maps of urban areas across the South in particular, historically, you know, large swathes of those urban areas were left off the map, or they weren't enumerated or differentiated or specified in any particular way. And so those that resided there, weren't really visible. But yet that invisibility cut in two different ways. It allowed a certain kind of flexibility to create particular kinds of livelihoods and forms of inhabitation that could be left out of the count, that could figure out ways of avoiding scrutiny and discipline. But yet that resourcefulness, these lifetimes themselves were often drawn upon in order to make the city work in ways that it couldn't otherwise work. That is, the fiction of the city is somehow specifiable as a kind of series of forward and backward linkages and of agglomeration. And the fiction of the city is some kind of a system, some kind of metabolism. Of course, it doesn't work according to that fiction. So who bears the brunt of responsibility for operating outside of those forms of recognition and those forms of accountability in order to make, in some sense, the city then really, really work? So in some ways, those that are marginalized, those that are left out, are not only marginalized and left out because they're deemed disposable or ineligible or expendable, but their expendability is also the basis from which they are able then to, in some ways, be incorporated as a kind of work, as a kind of labor outside of calculation, outside of computability, outside of measurement. So in some ways, this kind of notion of risk and accountability cuts two ways. It's one can see it as a kind of double oppression, and one could also see it as a kind of embodiment of an urbanization that in some ways exceeds the count. Because the conundrum is, you want to be made visible, but you're being made visible according to a kind of framework which you don't really determine and control. So you want to make yourself visible, but by virtue of making yourself visible, you're in some ways already lesser or already counted in a lesser way. So how do you circumvent that count? Circumventing provides some autonomy, but the autonomy itself is relied upon in many respects to make the fiction of the city work.
Evelyn, I have to ask you as a demographer who studies marginalized communities. So, your job is to try and figure out who they are, what do you think of the comments that Abdulmalik just shared about how of these marginalized populations?
I think they're brilliant. So I'm sort of thinking about this in a very sort of historical way, and sort of a global sense of, so typically demographers speak of nations in terms of them being either developing or developed. And the developed nations are what we typically consider the Western world. And historically, what has sort of gone on in demography and largely social sciences is that the Western world has this sort of accounting of history where we delineate things and say, okay, this country is developing versus this country is developed. But implicit in that, or not implicit, but underlying that is also the fact that we're not thinking about in terms of different classifications over time and thinking about the population as, okay, here are the countries that we've decided to colonize, and here are the countries that we have not colonized. And so in that sort of lack of history in demography, at least, we're not really taking on the responsibility of colonization. We're not taking on the responsibility of actually taking away the wealth of these nations or anything like that. Instead, we're just saying there's something wrong with them. But we come forward to this point in time and we wonder, okay, well, why aren't these nations behaving as we want them to do? What does it mean to be a civilized nation? And one way in which we think about civilized nations is that you control your fertility, okay? And so it's like, I don't know why they can't control their fertility. I don't know why they can't get this together. At the same time, the Western world is having an issue with low fertility. And it's been going on for decades. And so first we started with thinking about pro-natalist policies, and that didn't work. Next, we moved on to saying, hey, let's take the nations that we've colonized and invite them to be citizens. Because maybe if we do that, then that will increase the population. That didn't work either. And so they're sort of stuck with this low fertility. But the reality is that globally, the total fertility rate is 2.5, which is above replacement level, which is 2.1. 2.5 meaning that on average, women during their childbearing years will have 2.5 children, okay? And 2.1 is not a replacement. The 0.1 is because some women die during childbearing years. So global fertility is above replacement. But the way that the stories are spinning right now are focused mainly on these developed nations. And I think the most ironic piece of this all is that COVID has actually brought in this sort of interesting intersection, where in these developed spaces, one of the big things that is shaping the panic is the dependency ratio. Okay, or basically the fact that we have aging populations and not enough people to actually support those aging populations. COVID cuts the aging populations of all nations, so it reconfigures the age structure of what's going on, which actually might sort of fix some of the problem, but still there's this ignorance of us actually being a global world in which 90% of the vaccinations being taken by the wealthiest spaces, and not thinking that, hey, you know what, this outbreak means that really what's happening is we'll have these various variants. And if we want to think nation by nation by nation, sure, that works. But the reality is in a pandemic, we all matter. And so those variants will continue to come home to roost in the very nations that took away the wealth from the societies that could have actually sustained themselves if not for the global violence that has been done to the global south.
There's a really interesting and provocative book by Michelle Murphy that came out recently called The Economization of Life, where she talks about how precisely the Cold War, US's Cold War interest in women's rights or family planning in places like Bangladesh and other places in South Asia was precisely a means to control the population. And while the rhetoric was about women's rights, which we might hear often now, in fact, it was about population control, precisely what you're talking about, Evelyn. So I think it's really relevant.
Yeah, so we have a tradition, and actually, there's a tradition of just talking about the politicization of fertility and how sort of the tactic is to say, oh, we're for women's rights, and oh, we're for this or that. But really, we are just trying to control fertility. And there's something wrong with nations that see like having 3 children or 4 children as the norm. But really, those are the nations that are sustaining us. Those are the nations who we continue to reap the benefits of, at least in those nations that get to be called developed. And yet, those are the nations that I see something like COVID being a very nice example of how one can actually decimate the developed world, because the developed world fails to actually see anything beyond their interest, anything outside of the city that they've developed.
Olga, I want to ask you a question related to this, because I know that you've thought a lot about what development means. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are about, the meaning of development in this sense, and kind of the what we're talking about now, which is the uneven distribution of resources, but also of risks, et cetera, that are constitutive actually of the term and concept of development as it emerged, in the post-war period.
Sure. First of all, I want to say that I'm not a historian of development. There are so many people doing it, but much better than I even touch on it. And part of the problem is my shifting scholarly identity, which I'm trying to embrace. So, but I like the point that Evelyn is making, and I want to say that I have been thinking that maybe this is not to control. It is an attempt to control social reproduction, not just fertility. Like who gets to control which races are going to exist in the world and where the resources are going to go, I think. But in terms of development, I was thinking, not in terms of development, but I was thinking for today that my contribution was going to be about the place outside the city plan as a place of and a site of resilience. And here I'm relying more on the work of Konstantina Kalfa and Ioanna Theocharopoulou, and I'm bringing an example from my homeland, so I'm tapping onto my personal experience as well. And I will be sharing the screen. Here we are. Oops, not this one. And full. So what you see here is a historical image from Athens at a moment of its modernization. So you see the older construction of Athens is this part over here, where you have all these working class refugee housing, because there have been population exchanges happening for the first half of the 20th century after the end of the Ottoman Empire. And this kind of movements happened in Greece in a very peculiar and interesting way to me. Politicians going around the Ottoman Empire and announcing to their Greek constituents that if they want to be Greek, they need to move back to Greece and they will be given land, right? So they were given land, small plots of land, which were decided, these exchanges of populations were designed in the League of Nations. So here I'm just announcing what I'm thinking my next project is going to be. So what happened with that is that after World War II, there was a very intensive need for reconstruction in Greece to house the population, because the population was really growing because of immigration, but also because it was growing as well. And the urban fabric was destroyed from bombings. And the way to do that, it was a very inventive construction scheme. So the landowners called antiparochi, so it means instead of giving money. So the landowners would come together and form a bigger plot of land and invite a contractor to build a multi-floor residence, which you see here, for example. It's called polykatikia. And this multi-floor residence, it would have apartments from which the contractor would make a profit, but also he would give back to the family 2 or 3 apartments within each multi-floor residential building, within each polykatikia. And the reason for that was also the structure of the Greek family, because the Greek family was patriarchal and there was a demand of a dowry. So every family got at least 3 apartments, 1 for the family and 2 for the kids, for example, right? So this was a means by which planning happened and city making happened without planning, in a way, like if we consider planning to be something that happens top down. And when this was happening, because sometimes people did not have money to complete their structures, they would leave these very interesting things that you see here, which are the metal bars that go inside the reinforced concrete, so that in the future they could add on top of that building another building. So this is also another tactic of city making. And the areas that were outside the plan of the city, there was a regional plan of how the city was meant to develop. The areas that existed outside this plan were the areas where the immigrants would go, the poorer people would go, and they would build outside, basically outside the plan meant outside the infrastructure, in anticipation of getting these areas recognized as inside the plan. So these liminal areas became crucial zones for the expansion of the city, crucial zones for pressure, for people to pressure actually to get these areas recognized, but also very risky areas for investment, because they were more susceptible to, they were not abiding to building code, they were more susceptible to catastrophes as fires. In Greece, there are many fires happening. So I think this is an example of how the lack of top-down planning makes a city, and then also creates a problem of mismeasurement looking forward. But I think I want to offer it as an example of different kind of planning that is not planning. I think that's the main point that I would like to make.
Yeah, and actually, Olga, just to follow up on that, there's a comment from, and a question actually from the audience, Pietro Saita, who asks, I mean, he addresses it specifically to Ayala Levine, but I think it can also be to what you just said. He writes, I would love to ask Professor Levine whether she believes that in general, decisions to reinforce the cities are that technical. By operating in a Southern European town, which presents many communalities with non-European experiences discussed over this presentation. So he's writing from the city of Messina in Sicily. I have the impression that decisions depend not so much on data, but from the weight of political forces. I think what you're talking about, Olga, electoral calculation and the like. Isn't there the risk to over-evaluate the importance of measures, data, et cetera, which are often a way to shield and justify non-technical decisions? Data, after all, can be told in so many different ways.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. It's for Ayala, so I will leave Ayala to respond. But like, what I can say about this question is that the acceleration of this construction system happened during the dictatorship in Greece. And this happened because the dictators changed, according to scholar Maloutas, changed the code so people could build 20% more. So they could make more profit out of the apartments and the buildings that they would create, right? And this was a political move for the people living in Greece to have a buy into the dictatorship that was at place, right? So it was like the built environment used as a means for politics in a very substantial way.
The same thing, however, happened in Spain, which Christopher writes about, not under dictatorship, but it was precisely, there were financial incentives precisely to build and potentially make profit under a democratic system, right? So we're not, I don't think that this is necessarily particular to a political regime. But Christopher, I don't know if you want to make a comment about.
No, I think it's, I think any history of real estate speculation always goes back to, and I'm going to put it in air quotes, but the developing context. It implicitly generates speculative activities. And we can look at the United States, to the Transcontinental Railroad, to, Florida in the 1920s, these kind of landscapes that are opened up to transformation invite activity in building that inevitably lead to these kind of, as Olga was describing, sort of hope to be included by preemptively building before things have been permitted. And I think Spain is an interesting case study, because essentially what the central government attempted to do was open up all land within the country. This is in the late 1990s, mid 1990s. Open up all land in the country that wasn't designated as ecologically notable or historically relevant as being urbanizable, and that was something that the proportion of the territory that was available for development was exponentially increased. That law was quickly struck down, but the individual municipalities and comunidades recognized the economic potential of that and went back and sort of enacted their own laws at a more local, at a more regional level, because Spain's government is set up that you can't have sort of central dominion over land policy. And it was sort of taken up by all political points of view because of the potential implied within it. So I think we could probably find many stories that are comparable to what Olga was describing in Greece, in terms of, in some ways the political structure doesn't matter. It's the possibility that's implied by the land policy.
Ayala, yes.
So it is the story of the political pressures that dictate the planning is something that Otto Königsberger, that action planning planner, thought about when he was actually saying, forget participation. We, the planners, do not need to include participation. We are actually striving to participate ourselves. Let them include us, because between the policymakers, between the politicians, and between the constituencies and the real estate value, the planners are actually the ones that are lagging behind, that can't get any foot in the process at all. So this is a tension here, that the disciplinary planning profession versus all these forces on the ground, the real forces and the time lag between planning, surveying, and then implementation. This is what at stake here. And the stories that you're telling us, the story of the anti-parochi that Olga told us, this is not a story about planning so much as a story about political action on the ground. Yeah, I wonder what the planners in the crowd, the actual planners, think about that.
I won't name the place. So the other half of my life is actually as a practicing urban designer. And, we are involved in a project presently where it's exactly as you described. It's a large scale real estate development proposition that's being pursued by a private entity, where they are ahead of the city planners in terms of the process of thinking about what a community wants to be or what it wants to look like. And so this is in an American context, so very, very different than many of the examples that we're giving. But I think you're precisely right that in some way, the point was made earlier, in some ways, the data, the measure around urbanization is rhetorical. It very much, and I think this is what Abdul Malik was getting at, which is this idea of city as a fiction. It's being used to shape the act of building is being used to shape political stature and political positioning, whether that's at a kind of a community level or if it's at a state level. I think it applies at both scales. So I think your observation, Ayala, is it's absolutely correct. I mean, in practice, I've experienced exactly that disconnect in terms of timing of those processes.
And it is a historical desire in the sense that, you know, before the UN was even formed, they had this World Engineering Conference, technical conference, where basically planners came in and said, we want to be part of the reconstruction and we want to be part of the UN as an organ that can organize, actually bring all these experts together and then feed back into, you know, newly decolonized or decolonizing nations and territories. And we have a record of these planners attending the signing of the UN Charter in San Francisco and raising the questions, and later within the UN raising the questions, making charts and raising the questions in seminars. Like, so there is a constant desire to be included. You're so right. But the question is, like, these are the professional planners. Why do we think the anti-parochie is not planning? And it has different planners in a way. It's like the contractor and the residents, but aren't these planners? Just a provocation. I understand the implication.
I think that it's a question of scale and a question of relationship. So if you just plan for a specific land parcel, you can't be considered a planner with the authority that you would have as a municipal planner. So it's more like a development, a real estate development project rather than city planning.
Right, and so there's actually a question related to this topic from Martha Frisch. And she asked, throughout the US and a lot in Europe, I think the primacy of politics, real estate development, municipal power structure consistently dominates the professional urban planner community. Can you think of an exception to this?
Outside of the US?
Sure, yes.
Yes, I'm coming from Israel. So Israel had a national plan that was set up in the early 50s after the confiscation of lands from Palestinians. And the entire country, the land itself is not something that you can buy, you can lease land. So the idea, the understanding of land as a commodity is completely different and allows for much more planning to happen. And the same, even in Western Europe, you would have a situation where planners work with the government and the population in very different ways than in the US in terms of public trust in politicians and experts. That does not happen in the US. So I guess everywhere in the world is actually so different than the US. The US is so specific in its relationship to land.
Another example, and Sony referred to it earlier, it would be Singapore, right? I mean, the hand in glove relationship between Singapore's urban planning and their sort of the governance of the island is so tied up. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew's sort of original vision for demonstrating modernity related to the physical form of the island. And I think what you've seen, particularly in many of the kind of consultancies and planning and engineering practices that have come out of that legacy, going into places like India, going into places like Rwanda and saying, this is what we do. We tie sort of political power to city building. And many of those projects, those sort of Newtown projects that Sony was mentioning, I think come from that legacy of that relationship, you know, that you can tie back 60 plus years to the origins of that country.
Paul, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just briefly, because maybe I misunderstood the question, but I think there are many alternatives, both historically and in the current context. Going to Olga's point, you know, that, well, who are we talking about as a planner? Yeah, if it's the Department of Planning and Zoning, there's one thing, but you know, we all know community-based planning is out there, right? So involving the community, or the idea that, you know, the neighborhood plans its own infrastructure. I mean, as Abdulmalik was saying, the people that are written now, but they're still planning their communities. So it's just a different kind of planning and a different kind of control, and obviously a different relationship to power. But certainly, I would still call it planning. So maybe it's a scale question, following up on Ayala.
I think that many of the comments are already kind of touching on the last theme that I want to get to, which is about scale itself. And you know, I had framed this question of scale in terms of speculation, right? Does speculation assume a certain scale? Do practices of quantification assume a certain scale? But related to the question that I'm asking, I want to share a comment from Arijit Sen, who has a comment that I think pertains. He says, the comments about the concrete columns by Olga is important because, as Abdulmalik points out in his book, The City Yet to Come, these structures are signs of an emergent potentiality of new forms of urbanism, always emergent and aspired to. In that way, it is also a form of grassroots planning, or a form of grassroots planning process. This also makes a huge change in our methods of documentation and quantification. So I'm folding his comment into mine. So if our ideas about development, of scale, of speculation, quantification assume a certain type of, or assume a scale, a large scale, I'm thinking, a regional scale, as Ayala mentioned in hers, even Sony's maps of the master plans. Right, he asks, could we talk about new methods of documentation, quantitative analysis, I don't know, analysis that accommodates cities yet to come? And he writes as a follow-up, this suggests a huge change in our methods of documentation and quantification. So I guess the first question is much more simple, like does speculation assume a certain scale? What is that scale? Does quantification, the effectiveness of quantification for certain purposes assume a certain scale, and why? Right? And then I think we can fold in some of the concerns and questions that Arijit raises. If you don't mind, Wendy, can we turn back to you as our mensuration? I mean, in your studies of the social practices of commensuration, right? Is there, and especially you mentioned rankings, but I know that you've studied also other forms of, maybe not related to cities per se, but quantification in general. Does it assume a certain scale? How is that scale determined?
I think one thing that quantification can do is produce a scale. So what is a global city? Well, a lot of times the way that we understand what global means is, it's through various forms of quantification, whether it's population or ranking or GDP or whatever. So I think, maybe I'll flip the question around a little bit and see, as quantification as producing scale. And if you'll indulge me, I wanted to just relate something that's kind of back in our conversation, but I wanted to respond to Abdul Malik. I'm very fascinated by sort of the way that cities depend on the invisible. And I was trying to think of instances when the invisible was really important. It reminded me of the production of credit ratings, where now everyone has a credit rating that's kind of produced by, in the United States, 3 big companies, and your capacity to remain invisible from that is really, really valuable, but it's very hard to accomplish because marginalized groups that ever have an eviction or ever have, haven't paid their bills on time, that permanently follows them around now, and that controls where they can live. They're often not rented to, or so on and so forth. So anyway, I just wanted to touch back on what I think is your really interesting point. It's the power of the invisible, and escaping from surveillance is something. So sorry, that's all I have to say about scale. So I mean, you can measure on any scale, right? And scale really matters. The unit of analysis, I mean, I'm sure Evelyn can talk about this too, but the unit, what you see depends on, sort of the unit of analysis that you're looking at. And that's a crucial component of constructing scale, what you see.
And Evelyn, for example, how are those determined, right? How do you determine the scale of analysis? What do you ask yourself when you're determining that?
I'm not sure what I ask myself. When I'm thinking about scale of analysis, I guess I'm going to be thinking about context. The one thing that came to mind, I guess, during the course of discussion and thinking about planning, and thinking about the US context, and does the US context, do we actually plan anything? And there were a few institutions that came to mind where we're thinking about planning and where scale doesn't, well, scale is sort of built on how much control we want to exert. So the things that came to mind were the mental health institutions, prisons, and detention centers. And those are things that come to mind probably because I know something about them, and also because we actually did plan for these things. So there wasn't just a mass incarceration thing that was going on, but there was also a prison boom that happened in the US context, and we're thinking about scale. So we built prisons, and then we decided to incarcerate such that there would be people inhabiting those prisons. And so in some ways, I'm thinking about, speculations and scale, but then we go back to what Wendy was saying and flipping it. Okay, so quantification is producing a scale. I'm not really sure what comes to mind besides in the US context, somewhat gentrification. In some other contexts, I think about refugee populations. So for example, in Israel, one of the things that is, I guess, sort of, so one of the things that I confront when I go to Israel is that it's, most of the time I stay in Tel Aviv, okay? And I'm looking at this lovely city of Tel Aviv with lots of cats, but that's besides the point. And then I enter into a very different space. And that space is sort of obviously there for a specific population, and it is the refugee population. And I'm sort of walking through and realizing just how different things happen when I cross into that sort of different space. And I am wondering if this space or the planning of this space is something that was done to sort of segregate that population. But at the same time, I can come back a year later and I can see how the people of that community have actually taken charge of it and I guess made it into something completely different. And so there's sort of disorganization on one point in time, but then I see a completely different set of organized businesses arise. And it's still in a sort of segregated way, but I do see some sort of change. And so it's sort of, again, sort of playing on both this sort of, okay, are we thinking about scale, or is it actually that the population itself is dictating, is sort of resisting scale? And speculation.
Paul, I'm going to call on you because I know that this is a, just also you think a lot about scale and also to go back to an earlier theme, but the scale of risk that people have taken in your historical work. don't know if
Well,
you want to-
I didn't know whether Ayala wanted to respond, but I'll just,
Right.
oh, okay. Well, I'll jump in because I actually want to twist this conversation a little bit because in some senses, and I don't know how people feel about this, we're abstracting data. Right. So data, we always, oh, data is an abstraction, but that's what we're doing in some ways too. It's just because scale, of course, right, is big data. And you've got scale and big data as surveillance and the problem, but versus the kind of more individualized response data planning. I think there are more critical ways of thinking about scale, though, as well. And and specifically in the digital humanities, I'm really moved by an article Jessica Johnson wrote a few years ago in Social Text, in which she talked about the transatlantic slave database. And she really tried to say, like, well, on the one hand, this is, I mean, I work on the Holocaust, so we would call it a perpetrator database, right? This is about counting bodies, and it's all about the imperial agenda of murder and labor. But, there's another way of imagining this that Johnson's also trying to get at. She's trying to say, well, like, what about those people that are written out of history, right? So how do we imagine them? But imagine them at scale, right? Not imagine them just as individuals. That's really important. But imagine their agency at scale. And I think that's a very profound kind of way of thinking about it, that because what it does, it gets back to the question asked by that audience member. Well, we can't do it from the historical record because they aren't in the historical record. Their agency isn't in the historical record. What do? Well, we have to imagine their agency. We're humanists. That's what art historians are. We have to be creative in how we think about their agency at scale. And that, I think, is a big challenge. That is something that is, and it's not only an historical challenge, it's a contemporary challenge for people in our worlds that are written out of journalism, written out of history, written out of, policy. And for me, that's about saying, so what is planning? What is the city? The city is an abstraction, but the city is also labor, which is at scale, right? It's not just your labor, it's the labor of your whole community. And how do we visualize labor in the city? How do we visualize construction? Not as design, not as finished building, but as that intermediary process. And I think there are ways, at least people that are struggling and trying to get at that. And they're trying to get at it precisely not by denying scale, not by seeing scale as merely a measurement that is an abstraction of power, but of seeing scale as actually accounting for the historical experience of millions of people that we don't usually account for in planning or in history. So that's my kind of take on that.
Here's a question from an audience member, Mary Rubin, and she writes about scale and futures and Abdul Malik's point about invisibility. How do we mediate these critical insights beyond academia, NGOs, to citizens who vote for local planners and politicians, and of course, interact with each other? I think of the effects Kiran Desai's book had on me, The Inheritance of Loss, though perhaps Paul would say this is not at scale. On agency, this is an aside, on agency, Walter Johnson on slave auctions is excellent.
I'll just add a quick footnote to that because I'm working with my students right now, going back to Evelyn's point, of mapping prisons in North Carolina. And it's about seeing that impact not only locally in terms of political economy, but also architecture, but also seeing it at the level of the state. And the goal there is not just to understand that, but of course the goal there is to give people information and tools and evidence about how ubiquitous it is and how much it's part of our state, and hopefully how we can impact that as citizens of the state. We're also working with public housing, for example, that same kind of question. So just throw that out there.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I think Mary's question goes back to this, maybe a broad issue that I raised right at the beginning, like how do we get out of this tyranny of computation, of quantification, et cetera? Evelyn.
So I think how you just ended that sentence is I guess the challenge. How do you actually take the tyranny out of quantification? especially when quantification has been, well, one way to actually deny basically humanity to populations. And one of the things that I'm thinking of and thinking about what Paul just said, and also comments from other people, is that one way we get back to really thinking about scale and refining the methods is actually to go from the sort of more aggregate, maybe city planning level, back down to the individual. If we're wanting to sort of give voice, give scale, give autonomy to the peoples who have been rendered invisible, then you actually have to speak to individuals who can tell you more about those people, and who can speak to the scale of their existence.
Wendy, please.
I'm usually not an apologist for quantification, but it's important to remember that visibility, can also be a benefit, in that for certain populations, like I know a little bit about the gay and lesbian rights movement in the United States, and Alfred Kinsey's ability to quantify sexual practices was an important moment in constructing visibility of a group that then became the basis of mobilization. So there are ways that a statistical community can also be sort of a progressive force for marginalized groups. But as Evelyn is suggesting, sort of reducing people to numbers is never enough.
We have come to 8 o'clock, at least in Paris time. The time has flown. I want to ask if there are, Sony's probably like, no, it's 2 o'clock in the morning for me. Are there any last comments that anyone wants to share, last thoughts? I know that we didn't come to any conclusions, but I think this is part of an ongoing process. If anyone has any last comments they want to share before we close the session.
Can I say I learned so much? Thank you all.
Yeah,
Thank you,
me
Min.
too. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you.
I want to thank so much the audience members and also everyone at ULIP. And I will just remind people that there will be a continuation of many of these topics in our contemporary world tomorrow at 6:30. Just email Anna Louise, Milne, or me for to register for the workshop tomorrow. Thank you again, everyone, to participants and to the audience.